It's been one of the strengths of the team the last 2 years. The Jets' defensive line still looks like the strength in 2024, but it will be different. Let's tackle the big questions on the defensive line today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, May 13th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today we're going to talk about the Jets' defensive line. We've been going position by position through the Jets roster, asking the big questions at each spot. And we move on now to a position group which is viewed as one of the best on the Jets roster, and that's the defensive line. And of course, they have the singular star in Quinnen Williams, but also a lot of other quality players sprinkled in. And I think if you are looking at this Jets defensive line heading into 2024, it still looks strong, but it looks different. They're different faces around. Quinton Jefferson is out. Bryce Huff is out. And there's another guy who was traded during the draft. And I think that this is the most intriguing question the Jets have on the defensive line. How do you replace John Franklin Myers? Now, I think in many ways, Huff is the superior player. When you're talking about just like his ability to get to the passer, but the Jets traded for Haason Reddick, and you can see kind of like a one-to-one. You kind of see that as like almost like a straight trade between the Jets and the Eagles, because even though Huff signed as a free agent with Philadelphia, he's there to replace Reddick, and the Jets traded for Reddick to replace Huff. So that's kind of like, and their games have similar styles. You could say Huff has youth; he's more of an ascending player. Reddick has the better resume; he's better against the run. He's a more complete player. But you can see that it's almost like a trade. Whereas with John Franklin Myers, the Jets gave him up to Denver. And it's not entirely clear how they will replace him, because it's not just about a player stepping in and taking his snaps. John Franklin Myers also played kind of a singular role on the Jets defense. He's a 290-pound guy, and the Jets, for the most part, run a 4-man defensive line. And when you run a 4-man defensive line, typically the guys who are 290 pounds, they play on the interior. They play like a defensive tackle spot because these are bigger guys. They play with more power. You usually only have like a 290-pound defensive end in a 3-man alignment, kind of like a classic 3-4 defense, even though those really don't exist anymore. You always hear about, does a coach run a 4-3 or a 3-4? In reality, because most offenses in this day and age have 3 wide receiver sets, most defenses are nickel. So for the most part, the Jets are playing a 4-2-5. And JFM played kind of a singular role in this defense. And even though the Jets played a 4-man line, in many ways, their alignment resembled a 3-man line. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the classic 3-4 defense, where you have three defensive linemen, you usually had 3 big guys. And the reason you have 3 big guys is that you have 1 less lineman than you do with the 4-man defensive line. So you had to add a little extra muscle to make up for the lack of an extra player. Well, in their 4-man defensive front, on their 4-man defensive line, the Jets play with 3 big guys, and then the last guy at the end is kind of your Bryce Huff types, your Carl Lawson types, the guys who just like a pure pass rusher who doesn't really worry about the run. And in many ways, that is kind of like that does kind of resemble like a classic 3-4 defense, because many 3-4 defenses, they have the three big defensive linemen whose job is just to kind of eat up space, and then you have like the one edge rusher, in the 3-4 defense, the guy's an outside linebacker. The defense the Jets run, he's a defensive end. He puts his hand in the dirt. And I think the reason JFM played that role, and if you watch the film, and this was especially true on early downs, the Jets defense is different on 1st and 2nd down from the way it is on 3rd down, or like obvious passing downs, and situations where it's 2nd and long, or situations where the Jets are trying to close out the game in the last 2 minutes. Obvious passing downs, the Jets defense is different. But on early downs in neutral situations, 1st and 2nd downs in neutral situations, JFM played a lot on that defensive end spot. And again, it's a bit unconventional for a 4-man defensive line to have a 290-pounder at end. If you watch what he does, he usually did not fire up the field as far as Bryce Huff did, or Jermaine Johnson did, or Carl Lawson did on the other side. Usually JFM was very conservative getting off the line of scrimmage. Now, part of that's, he's a bigger guy, so he's not going to be able to fire off as quickly, and he's not going to have that quick first step. But if you watch what he did, frequently he tried to secure the gaps to either side of him. He would try to get, like, in gaps are spots between two linemen, so the spot between a guard and a tackle, or a guard or a tackle and a tight end, even though I know tight ends aren't really linemen. JFM essentially tried to secure either gap of him to make sure there was gap integrity, to make sure, like, he could get off a block and stop the run. And only after he had the gap secured, that's when he started pushing back and he tried to collapse the pocket. He was very good at it. He had a very high pressure rate through most of his Jets career. But his focus at the beginning of a play was to, again, control the gaps, control the man in front of him. And I think that there was a very distinct reason for that, is that in the back seven of this defense, the linebackers, the corners, the safeties, the Jets like to play smaller. And you've seen that manifest itself in many ways. I mean, you've seen the Jets over the last 3 years convert many safeties to linebacker because safeties are faster. And you saw, CJ Mosley's playing at a lower weight than he did during his prime in Baltimore. And Quincy Williams, not a huge linebacker, very fast though. Jets like the back seven to be fast. Well, typically the faster players in the NFL, aside from the players who are like the true exceptions, the truly exceptional players, to be fast, you're usually smaller. If you're smaller, you have a tougher time shedding blocks. You have a tougher time, when a blocker gets to you, it's tougher to beat him. It's tougher to get off him. So if you look at the way this Jets defense is constructed, I think that there was a very clear plan in mind for JFM, in that his job was to essentially add some extra bulk to that line so that offensive linemen had a tougher time getting to the linebackers and to the safeties and to Michael Carter II, who, even though he's a slot corner, so he plays inside and he has run assignments. Essentially, they didn't want these offensive linemen to get to them. And JFM played that role very well. It's one thing to have a big guy eating up space, but JFM was also good at collapsing the pocket. He was also good at rushing the passer, getting to the quarterback, which is not typically true of your bigger type defensive linemen, especially at the defensive end spot. So the question becomes, how do they replace him? And, one obvious candidate might be Michael Clemens, who he was the guy who kind of stepped in last year when JFM needed a breather. He played that similar role, whereas you had Huff and Jermaine and, to the extent Lawson played on the other side. Those were the guys that fired up the field, whereas JFM and Clemens were the guys who, tried to secure the gap. And then after the gap was secured, they collapsed the pocket. They kind of put a bull rush on and tried to get to the quarterback. And outside of Clemens, there aren't really many obvious candidates. The Jets brought in Reddick, but Reddick, doesn't really play that role. And part of me feels like maybe this is a sign Clemens' snaps will increase, but there are only so many snaps to go around. So maybe Clemens gets some more snaps, but I don't think there's going to be that much more. I think the more likely solution is the Jets are pretty much sacrificing run defense for getting after the passer. And if you look, there have been many personnel moves since Robert Saleh took over, where the Jets kind of said, you know what, we'll sacrifice the ability to stop the run if it means we get more pressure to the quarterback. And I have to say that although I'm very critical of Robert Saleh in many, many ways, and I think Robert Saleh deserves a lot of criticism for his performance, and I think Robert Saleh has not proven himself at this point. Robert Saleh still has a lot to prove to show he belongs as a head coach in this league. But that's one philosophy that makes sense to me because, the old cliche, it's a cliche, but it's true. It is a passing league. And if you're going to, I don't think it's a bad strategy. I mean, think about the last 13 years. How many times have the Jets been able to completely shut down the opponent's run defense? And it doesn't matter. It's nice to be able to stop the run. I'd rather stop the run than be bad against the run. But if I can choose between shutting down an opposing passing attack and getting to the quarterback or stopping the run, I think you're going to choose getting after the quarterback every single time. And so it's just something the Jets might be willing to sacrifice. Now, another spot where I think the Jets have been willing to sacrifice is at that second defensive tackle spot behind Quinnen Williams. Jets have a new crew of defensive tackles this year. As we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to talk about Jets defensive tackles. We're going to talk about expectations, and we're going to figure out, is there anybody there who can be a worthy partner to Quinnen Williams? That's all ahead here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber. You're not burning cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We continue now talking about the Jets' defensive line position, some of the big questions the Jets have up front on the defensive side of the ball. Now, last year, the defensive line was a strength. I think if you're looking on paper this year, and of course, it's always on paper at this time of year, the Jets' defensive line looks strong again, but there are a lot of new faces. One constant is Quinnen Williams. Quinnen Williams did not go back-to-back as an All-Pro. In 2022, he had a breakout season where he made his first All-Pro team. He did not back that up again this season, but he still had a very strong year. Statistically, he may not have played at the same level, but I think if you were watching him on a play-to-play basis, he was still playing at an extremely high level. He's an absolute star, one of the top two players on the roster. But the cast next to him will be different. Out is Quinton Jefferson. Out is Al Woods. In are Javon Kinlaw and Fatu, who was signed from the Arizona Cardinals. And there is one familiar face. Solomon Thomas is back with the Jets for yet another season. So I guess he's the familiar face at the defensive tackle spot. But I think there's a question, can any of these guys step up for the Jets at the defensive tackle position? And I think that if you're looking at the way the Jets have built their roster, their philosophy has kind of been that at the defensive tackle spot, we've got Quinnen Williams. Any halfway decent player is going to look good next to him. And I think that, it's justified. If you look at the season Quinton Jefferson had last year, he looked pretty good. 2 years ago, Sheldon Rankins, during Williams' breakout season, Sheldon Rankins had a very strong season, got a nice payday when he left the Jets. But I think there is a drawback to this sort of approach. And part of it goes with the way the Jets run their defense. I think, especially when you're talking about the defensive line, the Jets' defense is very easy to manipulate when you're talking about defensive line alignments. The Jets play what's known as a 3-4 over front. And, that may not mean a lot to you. It shouldn't mean a lot to you. It's not really that important to know that phrase. But essentially what that means is that the Jets align their defensive linemen in a certain spot. And it depends on where the strong side of the formation is. And the strong side of the formation, again, this is not a term really that important for you. But the strong side of the formation is whichever side the tight end lines up on. So if the tight end lines up on the right side of the formation is the strong side. If he lines up on the left side is the strong side. And the other side is known as the weak side. And essentially, that's the way that we're on early downs. It's a little different when it gets to obvious passing downs, but on like first and second down in neutral situations, the Jets frequently run in what's known as an over front. And that means essentially you have your defensive tackle, you have your defensive ends who are out wide. Your defensive tackles align according to where the strong side of the formation is. And on the strong side of the formation, one of the two defensive tackles, the tackle who's on the strong side of the formation, lines up as what's known as the 3 technique. And the 3 technique is the outside shoulder of the guard. So it's essentially the shoulder that's closer to the tackle, not the shoulder closer to the center. It's the 3 technique is the outside shoulder of the guard. And the other tackle lines up on the weak side between the center and the guard. So I know that's a lot of terminology for you. Essentially, whatever side the tight end's on, one of the defensive tackle on that side lines up on the outside shoulder of the guard. The shoulder next to the tackle. The weak side guy, the guy who's not on the side of the tight end, lines up between the center and the guard on the weak side. And this makes the Jets' defensive line a little bit easy to manipulate because you can just put your tight end in motion, then the Jets make a shift. The Jets essentially have to shift to where their linemen are aligned. And the reason that this is significant is the tackle who is on the strong side is very difficult to double team because he's on the outside shoulder of the guard. So he's on the side, essentially lined up close to the tackle. He's on the guard side that's closer to the tackle. So the tackle can't really help him because the tackle has to block the defensive end. That makes that guy very difficult. The other tackle is lined up between a guard and a center. That guy it's almost a guarantee that guy's going to get a double team because he's next to the guard in the center. And generally speaking, the way schemes run now, the center usually isn't assigned a specific guy off the snap. He's only assigned a guy if like there's an extra blitzer. Typically, the center's there to help one of the guards. And the way these offenses run now, the Jets are very easy to manipulate because if you put your tight end in motion, you can make sure Quinnen Williams is between the center and the guard. And that means Quinnen Williams is going to get an automatic double team. And ESPN actually keeps stats on this stuff. And Quinnen Williams last year was double teamed 70. That's 70% of the time, which is extremely high, as you might imagine. I mean, if you look at other elite defensive tackles in this league, a lot of the elite guys are in the 60s, but Quinnen Williams was double teamed 70% of the time last year. And again, this all goes back to like the mindset that, look, you get any halfway decent tackle next to Quinnen Williams, he's going to get a lot of one-on-ones. And NFL caliber defensive tackles are going to succeed a fair amount of the time when they get one-on-ones. And if you look at the season Quinton Jefferson had last year, I think he benefited from all the attention that was paid to Quinnen Williams. Is Quinton Jefferson a great tackle? No. But because he got so many favorable matchups, he was able to rack up a number of sacks. And that's why, I've heard a number of Jets analysts say that Quinton Jefferson's a big loss. I'm not sure I necessarily buy into that because I think in many ways Quinton Jefferson was kind of a product of the circumstances presented to him. He was put into a really good spot. That said, I think one of the reasons Quinnen did not match his 2022 production in 2023, at least on the stat sheet, is because he faced so many double teams. And this is where you can kind of tie it together because, as I mentioned, 2023 stats weren't as good as the 2022 stats. But as I said, if you watched him on a play-to-play basis, if you watched the film, you saw a guy who was dominating consistently. And that's where the disconnect comes. That's where you can like tie these two things that sound like a disconnect together. All the double teams he drew naturally probably suppressed his statistical output. And I think the question is, and I guess the guy you look at is Javon Kinlaw of these tackles, because, Fatu, he's more of a run stopper. Thomas, I don't really know what Solomon Thomas does well. I mean, I know he had a couple sacks last year, but on play-to-play basis, Solomon Thomas was not that great. Javon Kinlaw, a former first-round pick. Jets gave him a pretty lucrative contract. They gave him $7 million guaranteed. In fact, by the end of this offseason, that contract is the reason the Jets are not getting a fourth-round compensatory pick for Bryce Huff. The Jets essentially chose Javon Kinlaw over a fourth-round pick. That's how much they think of Javon Kinlaw. He's a former first-round pick of San Francisco. Very disappointing player to this point in his career, although last year he at least started to flash a little bit as a pass rusher. And the question now is this a case where Kinlaw is a reclamation project? Because if you get a second good defensive tackle next to Quinnen Williams, it's going to do big things for this defense because that guy's going to feast on one-on-ones. And, Quinton Jefferson was okay last year. He wasn't bad, but Quinton Jefferson was far from a dominant player. And again, I think that anybody who's really bemoaning the loss of Quinton Jefferson, I think that's a tough thing for me to buy into because Quinton Jefferson, again, I think was very much a product of his circumstances. But is there a guy who can actually feast on this? Is there a guy who can generate a lot of production? And the reason that's so significant is that if you have a second guy the offense needs to account for, suddenly, if that guy starts producing havoc, teams might say, you know what, we got to double team this guy, which leaves Quinnen Williams more one-on-ones. It leaves him more opportunities to exploit those matchups, and maybe he can get back to recapture some of that 2022 production. I understand why the Jets build their team the way they do. I understand why they're approaching defensive tackle the way they have. It makes sense. If you look at like some of the other needs the Jets had on this roster, defensive tackle could not be a top priority. So I think maybe what they were trying to do with Kinlaw is they think that there's some untapped potential there. You have to remember Robert Saleh was the defensive coordinator in San Francisco when the Niners drafted Kinlaw. There was something there he liked. Can they untap that potential? And if they can he be the running mate Quinnen Williams needs to really unlock that 2022 production, get back to that level? And if he can, this Jets defense, which is already a good defense, moves to the next level. Speaking of first-round picks, the guy who didn't play that much last year for the Jets as a rookie, he was their first-round pick in 2023. As we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to talk about Will McDonald and whether or not the Jets can unlock his potential. Again, that's ahead here on this Monday edition of the show. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. If you're a Knicks fan, you can't be thrilled with what you've seen the last 2 games in Indiana, but the Knicks still have the home court advantage. Maybe the Knicks can bring home a series win and get back to the Eastern Conference Finals for the first time since 2000. If you're a Rangers fan, last game wasn't great, but you still got to feel pretty good about where you're at. The Garden could be alive for the Eastern Conference Finals this year. Will the Knicks and Rangers win? I don't know, but again, you can win on FanDuel with $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about questions that the Jets have on the defensive line. Here's a guy who's a bit of an enigma, Will McDonald. And the drafting of Will McDonald was a bit of an enigma last year because nobody was expecting the Jets to draft a defensive end. And when I say nobody, I mean nobody. I mean, if you look at other people who covered the Jets, nobody was talking about Will McDonald lead up to that draft. After the Jets picked McDonald, I was really worried because I was like, did I miss something? I didn't talk about Will McDonald at all. Well, nobody else did either. So I felt less guilty after I went through like other Jets analysts on the internet. I don't think I missed anything. That pick was just kind of out of left field, and it generated a lot of criticism. Now, was that criticism fair? I'd argue much of it was not, because at the end of the day, the draft is not, and as much as people may argue this, the draft is not about right now. It's not about year one. Most rookies don't step in and dominate. If you get a class where you have like 3 guys who step in day one and look like great players like the Jets did in 2022, it's a draft class of the decade for you. That usually doesn't happen. Sometimes first round picks are more likely to step in and dominate, but it's not that common. That said, I think you would like to have seen a little bit more from Will McDonald than the Jets got last year. I mean, he was really kind of a non-factor on the defensive side of the ball. And of course, after the Jets traded for Haason Reddick, I was talking about this. It wasn't really clear where the playing time was going to come from Will McDonald. Now, after the trade of John Franklin Myers, and we go back to what we talked about in the first segment, that opened up a spot because the Jets like to rotate defensive linemen in and out. And typically, like, your top 3 defensive ends get starter snaps in the Saleh defense. Now, as I mentioned in the first segment, there's a question about who's going to fill the role of JFM. It's not, Will McDonald's a different type of player from JFM. He's a guy he's got length, but he's not as big. He can't really fill that that gap plugging role. He's not really a pocket collapser. I think if Will McDonald succeeds, he's going to develop an arsenal of moves. He's going to figure out how to use his arms, develop some counters. The question is, how good can he get? Now, one thing about Will McDonald is, even though he's entering his second season, and look, I'm not saying Will McDonald is old, but I would also say he's not that young, especially for a guy entering his second season. In fact, he's only a year younger than Bryce Huff, who just finished year 4. And Bryce Huff's just hit free agency. McDonald is in the mid-20s range. He was an older prospect when he was drafted. Now, I think when a guy's an older prospect, a lot of people kind of get it wrong. They think, well, who cares if you draft an older prospect? It just means his prime won't be quite as long. The issue with an older prospect, especially one that's already, especially one who's a bit of a project like Will McDonald was, is he has less. He's already kind of close to his athletic prime. And I think, once a guy gets to 24, 25, that's close to being as good as you're going to get. So I think there's a lot of pressure for Will McDonald to produce this year. I think this is a year that's very much a make or break year for McDonald, because ultimately, if he doesn't produce this year, if he doesn't step up and have a quality season, and last year we talked about what expectations are for a guy drafted 15th overall at the defensive end spot. If McDonald's a consistent 7 to 8 sack a year guy who, in a career year maybe gets 10 and goes to a Pro Bowl, that's a successful pick for that range. If you look historically at what players drafted in that area typically get you, I think that's the expectation this year, because I don't know that McDonald has that much room to grow. We're already in year 2, and people may disagree with this, people may argue this, but like 9 times out of 10, we actually know whether a guy's good after his second season. Not always after his first season, but after year 2, like 9 times out of 10, the guys who are good are already good. And people like try and dispute this. People always say, after a guy's kind of been up and down the first 2 years, we don't really know what we have in him. In reality, you kind of do. You just don't want to admit it. If a guy hasn't produced by the end of year 2, the odds are against him of being a good player. And the Jets have things. I mean, the Jets have something invested in McDonald. He was a first round pick. And again, he was kind of like he was kind of an outside the box first round pick. And going back to what I said a year ago, if Will McDonald becomes a consistent 8 sack a year guy, nobody's going to care that it wasn't the need in 2023. Like, nobody will ever look back and say that was a bad pick because it didn't address an immediate need. Because at the end of the day, you really only care whether a guy's good. You don't really care what position he plays for your team. And defensive end's a spot where I just have the philosophy you can never have too many good defensive ends. There are certain spots on the field, quarterback's one of them, wide receivers one, offensive line's another, corner's another. There's certain spots where I just don't think you can have enough quality players, and especially defensive end, the way the Jets approach that position where they're rotating guys in and out through the course of the game. They want to have their guys. They want to be able to substitute guys in and out without losing quality. Usually when you put a backup in, there's a big drop off in production. The Jets, the reason they invest so much at the defensive line is that they want to keep their guys fresh for the end of the game. When the Jets are closing out a game, when they've got a 4-point lead in the last 2 minutes, they want their pass rushers to be fresh. And the way to do that is to give them plenty of rest during the game. Give your top guys plenty of rest during the game. So that's where Haason Reddick's going to get plenty of rest during the early stages of games, because the Jets want him fresh. So McDonald's going to sub in quite a bit for Haason Reddick. Jets want Jermaine Johnson fresh to close out games. So that's where McDonald's going to be important, because he's going to give those guys plenty of rest so that when the game's on the line, I don't know if McDonald's going to be on the field that much when the game's on the line, but he'll play an important role because Jets want to get quality pass rushing snaps while Reddick and Jermaine are resting. And that's why, this is why it's important. And that's why Jets want to have be able to constantly send in waves of quality defensive linemen who can get to the quarterback. Can McDonald do it? Look, when the Jets drafted him out of Iowa State, kind of raw. They didn't have a ton of developed pass rushing moves. He's had 1 year to work with his coaching staff. What can the coaching staff get out of him? I don't think McDonald's a player the season hinges on. I don't think he's a type of player that makes or breaks this season for the Jets, but he is a player in some ways. He kind of makes or breaks the overall team building philosophy, because they went out on a limb to get him in 2023. The question is, was it because they saw something in him, and were they right? And can they develop him? And I think that this has a significance for this regime that's in charge of the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.